Hello, my name is Dr. Kate Cantrell, and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Writing, Editing and Publishing at the University of Southern Queensland. I'm presenting this paper on behalf of my colleagues, Professor Jessica Gildersleeve, Professor of English Literature, and Dr. India Bryce, Senior Lecturer in Human Development, Wellbeing and Counselling. We are a multidisciplinary team specialising in the literary, cultural, and health and wellbeing intersections of trauma, literature, and education. The title of our presentation is Traumatisation, Critical Reflection, and Painful Pedagogy, Students' Reflexive Engagement with Difficult Content. In their series of recommendations for teaching sensitive topics in the study of forensic and legal medicine, Kennedy and Scriver report that any reasonably sized class of university students today will likely contain individuals who have had direct or indirect experiences of trauma. Recent international and cross-disciplinary studies report that anywhere between 66 and 85% of undergraduates have already experienced at least one traumatic event prior to entering university. Close to 1/3 of students report 3 or more potentially traumatic events, and between 10 and 15% meet the criteria for full or partial PTSD. The most common traumatic events reported by university students relate to household dysfunction, life-threatening injury or illness, the sudden death of a loved one, natural disaster, and physical violence. The prevalence of trauma and risk for trauma in higher education is a severe and persistent problem, associated as it is with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, as well as higher rates of attrition, poor adjustment, and academic underperformance. Trauma is defined as an individual's psychological and physiological stress response to a life-threatening event or a physically or emotionally harmful experience. Neurobiological research has established that trauma hinders the development of brain areas associated with cognition, memory, and language. Trauma jeopardizes an individual's ability to engage in formal learning and to achieve academic success. For this reason, trauma is a strong factor of academic failure. Established educational research recommends that higher education instructors approach the delivery of sensitive material with purpose and with caution, always considering the potential impact of traumatic exposure on students and the possibility of re-traumatization. Re-traumatization refers to traumatic stress reactions or symptoms that develop after multiple exposures to events that are perceived as traumatic. Re-traumatization also refers to the triggering or reactivation of traumatic stress reactions in response to a situation that mirrors prior experiences, events, or relationship dynamics. Practitioners in the human services instinctively understand the mechanisms by which trauma survivors can be inadvertently triggered or re-traumatized, not only by certain events, situations, or environments, but by institutional policies and practices, and by both mediated and unmediated representations of trauma events in the media. Trauma-informed care is a socio-cultural model of service delivery that recognizes the prevalence of trauma and the impact of traumatic experience on individuals, families, and their communities. Trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework that seeks to prevent re-traumatization and to promote resilience and recovery by employing a skills-based approach to coping and capacity building. Many human service agencies, including those involved in child protection, education, and social work, have sought to address the issue of re-traumatization through trauma-informed approaches to practice. These approaches adopt a shared set of principles that guide organizational structures, policies, and procedures in order to prevent re-traumatization of both clients and staff. These principles are ensuring safety, establishing trust, maximizing choice, prioritizing empowerment, maximizing the opportunity for collaboration, and demonstrating respect for diversity. These principles or core values are fundamental for good clinical practice and essential for working with those who have or are likely to have trauma histories. However, despite the movement towards trauma-informed practice in child welfare and behavioural health, trauma-informed pedagogy remains more the exception than the rule in higher education. And remarkably, trauma-informed practice remains rare, even in tertiary level programs that aim to prepare students for clinical practice. This lacuna between research and practice is doubly confounding, given that there is a significant body of evidence that documents the various impacts that exposure to trauma can have on helping professionals, including pre-service students and particularly those who have a trauma history or limited clinical experience. Exposure to the trauma of others puts practitioners at greater risk of being re-traumatized, as well as greater risk of developing secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout. Secondary traumatic stress, also described as secondary traumatization and compassion fatigue, refers to trauma-related symptoms that may develop as a result of empathizing with trauma survivors. Vicarious traumatization refers to the cumulative impact of working with trauma survivors and the disruption this poses to a helping professional's identity through, for example, a significant shift in one's beliefs and values or worldview. Burnout refers to the cumulative impact of chronic work-related stress, which is typically associated with continuous exposure to structural oppression and social injustice at work. Prolonged exhaustion may be caused by unreasonably high or disproportionate workloads, unfair disciplinary practices, a lack of training or supervision, and a lack of control over the development of workplace policy and procedure, all of which can lead to low job satisfaction, employee absenteeism, and feelings of hopelessness, frustration, and inadequacy. Unlike the phenomenon of re-traumatization, individuals can experience secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout without having directly experienced trauma themselves. Therefore, it's important to understand and distinguish between these two distinct categories of traumatic experience. Both can arise in the higher education context, and both have unique implications for educators and students. To date, research in this space has generally focused on mental health and the first year experience, since there is evidence to suggest that first year is a time of particular vulnerability for students, as well as a time when students are at the peak age for trauma exposure. In the Australian higher education context, available data reinforces the chronic and cumulative nature of traumatic experience, with international findings corroborated by national surveys of student experience and engagement. For example, the 2014 First Year Experience Survey, conducted by the University of Melbourne, found that in 2014, the majority of first-year students, that is 72%, cited poor emotional health as the reason for deferring, a figure that represents a sharp increase from 56% of students only 5 years earlier in 2009. First-year mature-age students, another high-risk population, report high levels of academic motivation, but also high levels of anxiety and stress due to poor mental health, financial concerns, and a fear of failure. While methodological issues make it difficult to understand the magnitude of the problem, Stallman found in a national survey of 6,500 students from two large Australian universities that 84% of students report elevated levels of distress. Interestingly, Stallman also found that the general population of university students report higher levels of psychological distress than those students who use university health services. In fact, the high prevalence of distress in students who do not seek professional help led Stallman to conclude that university students may accept or expect significant distress as just part of being a student. In light of these findings, there is a growing need for targeted initiatives that support the mental and emotional well-being of students. While most studies today rely on self-report measures, these studies clearly establish the need for interventions that enable students to reach their academic potential and fulfill their career aspirations. As Bryce and others have recently established, the decision to pursue a career as a helping professional may be driven by the need to make meaning of early life adversity or trauma and to give value to that experience by being of service to others. There is a high possibility that students who enter a helping profession have trauma histories themselves. In a study conducted in the 1980s, Rakusin and al. Found that as many as 50% of therapists have experienced childhood abuse or neglect or household dysfunction. Pope and Feldman Summers found that 1/3 of mental health professionals report a history of childhood abuse, with close to 40% also reporting some form of abuse in adulthood. Similarly, psychology students who aspire to work in mental health report a higher prevalence of both childhood sexual abuse and household dysfunction when compared with students outside the helping professions. The results of these studies raise interesting questions about the lived experience of trauma and its influence on career choice, and they are consistent with earlier research that highlights the prevalence of childhood trauma in the helping sector. While there is a significant body of research then that documents the impacts of trauma exposure in the helping professions, there is little empirical research on the effects of secondary traumatic stress in the arts and humanities. Trauma prevalence in higher education more broadly is alarming and confirms our observations of teaching into a first-year literature course that exposes students to difficult material. ENL 1001, Australian Stories, is a first-year literature course at the University of Southern Queensland that typically enrolls 120 students from diverse backgrounds. All students read and critique the same set of primary texts, most of which are Australian novels that deal with personal or national trauma and which challenge typical discourses of Australian history and culture. For this reason, one of the key pedagogical aims of our course is to unsettle students' cherished beliefs and assumptions about Australian stories and to draw attention to their prejudices, biases, and cultural blind spots. This objective is particularly important because it has been well documented that the study of Australian literature and Australian history more generally is often met with hostility and shame or a resistance to hearing the history. In an effort then to reduce the risk of negative response, we advocate for trauma-informed teaching and encourage our teaching team to heighten their knowledge and awareness of the risk and protective factors for students. Learning about the effects of trauma can help instructors to, 1, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, including the impact of trauma on a student's learning and behavior. 2, reduce the risk of re-traumatization by promoting self-care strategies that support learning in a safe and respectful setting. And 3, refer students to the appropriate support services. In other words, trauma-informed pedagogy, despite its slow uptake at the organizational level, can provide university instructors with a strengths-based, person-centered, and solution-focused framework for recognizing trauma's varying representations and manifestations, for acknowledging the prevalence of students' trauma histories, and for implementing pedagogical tools, strategies, and practices that best support the learning attainment and achievement of trauma-affected students. To this extent, several academics have published guidelines for teaching about trauma and for integrating trauma-informed approaches in the classroom. Trigger warnings, for example, are employed in some educational institutions to manage students' reactivity to difficult content. However, despite the prevalence of trigger warnings in the tertiary sector, the extent to which such warnings constitute a method of best practice has not been thoroughly addressed. Recently, we conducted a systematic literature review of the efficacy and suitability of trigger warnings as a strategy for reducing discomfort and distress among university students. We found that trigger warnings as one facet of trauma-informed care can support and promote students' emotional well-being. However, if trigger warnings are employed in isolation or in a tokenistic way, they can in fact be harmful to students, potentially inflaming existing stresses and exacerbating maladaptive behaviors, both of which can undermine students' autonomy and their ability to cope with potential distress. In other words, trigger warnings are not in themselves an effective strategy for managing or reducing trauma. However, when embedded as part of a broader, more holistic trauma-informed approach, trigger warnings can help manage and reduce trauma exposure. Therefore, in our first year course on the study of Australian literature, we advise students in the Week 1 introduction that the history of Australia has often been violent, troubling, and damaging, and that it makes sense, therefore, that Australian literature deals with such themes in an attempt to understand that history, whether long ago or more recent. Therefore, some texts on the course syllabus deal with violence, horror, and other traumatic themes. Rather than simply priming students to be reactive, we advise students that one of the course's primary objectives is to build their reading resilience and to equip them with the skills and knowledge required to endure with difficult texts and self-manage their critical and effective responses. Importantly, we don't provide trigger warnings in isolation without the opportunity for further debate or discussion. Rather, we use trigger warnings in conjunction with critical self-reflection as scaffolded through the use of a reflective journal that blends 4 evidence-based approaches for supporting engagement with difficult content: Herman's triphasic model of trauma recovery, Bowler's pedagogy of discomfort, Douglas et al.'s reading resilience framework, and Bain's 5 R's of reflective thinking. Since implementing the reflective journals in 2019, we have collected longitudinal data that demonstrates a significant impact on students' ability to manage their engagement with trauma narratives and to deconstruct their challenging reactions to sensitive content. Thematic analysis revealed a number of core themes that highlight the efficacy of reflective journaling for managing negative affect. In 2019, 48% of students who completed the journal reported using a number of reading strategies that they employed unprompted to endure with those readings that they perceived to be boring or unrelatable, unsatisfying, or too dark and confronting. Examples of these strategies include rereading, reading the work out loud, reading smaller sections of the text to improve comprehension, experimenting with different reading platforms such as e-readers and audiobooks, consulting secondary sources to better ascertain meaning, and establishing reading groups to share the intellectual and affective work of deconstructing the reading material. Although these strategies are simple, their range and the very fact of their application indicates a shift in student thinking around the benefits of engaging with difficult reading and of embracing, rather than resisting, difficult questions about the relationship between trauma, history, and complicity. As one student reflects, what made me feel really uncomfortable was the constant racism and child abuse. It was this feeling of being uncomfortable that made the novel challenging. Perhaps this is why I didn't enjoy this text as much, because it dealt with more negative portrayals of modern life that are most likely true. Grade distribution analysis also revealed that the introduction of the journals correlated with higher overall grades, as well as improved student progression and a reduction in fail grades and withdrawals. In 2019, 52% of students who completed the journal achieved a final grade of distinction or higher. In 2020, course progression improved by 23% and withdrawal rates decreased by 11%. In 2021, the average marks for each assessment achieved by those who completed the journal was around 10% higher than those who did not. In both solicited and unsolicited feedback, students report improvements in self-care and self-regulation, again emphasizing the value of reflective practice as an effective tool for managing traumatization. Course satisfaction also improved following the implementation of the intervention. To conclude, despite the fact that existing research acknowledges the importance of trauma-informed teaching, and despite emerging momentum for the integration of trauma-informed practices in tertiary curricula, there is still little research to date on what constitutes best practice in this space. There is also little work to date on the way that trauma-informed principles can inform curriculum design and delivery. As such, we need to further explore the use and value of trauma-informed teaching and consolidate and synthesize the existing evidence base on what is considered effective pedagogy in classrooms that use trauma-related content and materials. Students should be supported to deal with difficult material, and they should be provided with the knowledge and skills necessary to manage their reactivity. This type of skill building needs to begin in the first year of study in order to have a positive impact on retention and engagement, and to lay the groundwork for graduating citizens who are resourceful, resilient, and adaptable to change.